as free market ideology has infiltrated almost all aspects of social life, in addition to the endless wars and conflicts, people were alienated from their societies and nature. This has created an environment of dependency and profit generation, making consumerism the default meaning of life. During this episode of the Cosmopolitan Shipwrecks, we will cover the impacts of alienation and addiction on the individual and the collective. Also, explore the socio-economic as well as political solutions for addiction. Our guest is Bruce Alexander, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Psychology at the Simon Fraser University in Canada. He is the author of The Globalization of Addiction that elaborates on the dislocation theory of addiction. I would like to welcome Professor Alexander to our show and thank him for joining us.
Thank you, Mohammad, for having me.
And I also would like to welcome Arturo, who's also going to join us from this conversation. So maybe first I'd like to ask if you can give us a glimpse on your work and your research projects that you have worked on.
Well, I have worked in the field of addiction for 50 years, and really that's my main qualification. I have learned an awful lot in 50 years. I have spoken to, let's say, thousands of addicted people as a psychologist, and I have done some animal research, which became for a while slightly famous, the Rat Park animal research. And I have done a lot of research on Native people in Western Canada who have terrible addiction problems, which go back to their to the conquest, really, of the Native people, which was very recent here. It was only in the last 2 centuries that these people have been forced onto reservations. And I've also done a lot of work with rich addicts or middle class addicts. I mean, most of the work that we're familiar with, of course, is on poor and marginalized people. But I think it's important to know the effects on not so poor people. And so I have done a lot of research on that as well.
Mm-hmm. So if we can start first with, you mentioned the Rat Park experiment. Can you give us, I mean, in research, someone sometimes might fall in the prophecy bias, where one would set an experiment in order to, consciously or unconsciously, in order to get the results that fit in a certain hypothesis. Can you give us somehow a glimpse of what motivated you to work on the Rat Park experiment?
Yes, I was motivated to do the Rat Park experiments with my colleagues. It was a group effort, of course. We were motivated by the myth of demon drugs. In other words, people 40 years ago or 50 years ago totally believed that drugs had a kind of a demonic power, that they could possess people and transform them into addicts. No matter what else was on their mind or what else was on their lives, it didn't matter. The drugs had this demonic power. Now, some people still believe that, but 50 years ago, everyone believed that, and the scientists believed that. And so the impetus to do the Rat Park studies came from that very powerful idea. We thought it might not be true, and we now know it isn't true at all. But 40 years ago, we had very little support for that. Most people insisted that that idea was true, and so we did a series of very simple experiments, which started a whole trend in animal research, which we can now say that demon drug theory of drug addiction is simply not true.
And so in your book, The Globalization of Addiction, you take us in the historical journey to ancient Greece when you try to elaborate, while you're trying to elaborate on the dislocation theory of addiction that was a result of the Rat Park experiment. Can you elaborate more about the theory of dislocation and its historical perspective?
Yes, I think it's important always to start with Plato. I mean, he begins Western intellectual civilization, and he had a lot to say about addiction. Of course, he didn't have that English word, but he used the Greek words, which we translate into English as master passions. And he saw master passions as a risk, a terrible risk in certain kinds of societies. And he saw them as caused ultimately by the structure of declining democracies. Now, how he knew that is unclear to me, because he had only the Athenian world to work with at that point. But he saw a series of governments. He saw that when there were certain kinds of social breakdown, there are very high rates of addiction, and that the addicted people are apt to be in charge of the government. Now, those ideas are all important right now, but that was 2,500 years ago, 25 centuries ago that he said that, and that has been largely forgotten. But I think it has to be remembered. So I want to start the discussion there.
So you would say that Plato predicted the opioid and methamphetamine crisis before the election of Trump.
Yes, I would say that Plato predicted the addiction crisis. Of course, there were no methamphetamines, and in Athens there were no opioids either. But there were all the things that people get addicted to. Alcohol, of course, was available. There was lots of very nice wine, and power and wealth and sex. All these things were available, and he tended to talk about them all together. He talked about what we would think of as a dissolute lifestyle, people who center their lives on power and wealth and money, and sex and wine. And he said a major risk to society.
So it's a critique of hedonism as well as of addiction, which goes a bit further.
Well, I want to say that it's not hedonism. He was not saying that these people enjoy these things. He was saying that these people need these things because they haven't got anything better. They haven't got a full life. He used the word, which I do not pronounce correctly. It's a Greek word, dikaiosune. And he said that this balance of life is essential to everybody. And when this balance is destroyed, then people need other things, and they grab onto other things. It's amazingly modern. I mean, I really think if I were teaching addiction right now, I would always start with Plato. And in fact, when I did teach addiction, I always did start with Plato because his ideas are so important now. Now, of course, they were replaced later on with much simpler ideas. So if we get to the early Christians, we have, or even if we get to Aristotle, who followed Plato, we have much simpler ideas. But I myself really think we need to start with Plato.
So what was it like? The people were taking things that they have for granted, that they smaller group of people then tried to see their merit as the superior for others, so that they tried to grab more and more, and this created a cycle of vicious competition during Plato's period.
Yes. You've put it very well, Mohammad. It's that because people couldn't live a balanced life, they became competitive, to try to seek these relatively simple sorts of rewards, like money and power and sex, and wine. And it became terribly competitive. And he said, in such a society, the person who would become the king would be the most competitive of all. And so he not only predicted widespread addiction, but he predicted tyrants who were essentially people addicted to wealth and power and sex and wine. He predicted that the king would be the biggest addict of all. You have to read this. It's it's really important. I could send you the references.
I'm curious, and we are all curious as to your research involving the Native American cultures in Canada, and of course the very well-known high addiction rates in Native American reservations, especially. Uh, the reality of the Canadian Indian reservation has always somehow interested me, because I grew up on a small island which is not an Indian reservation, but is very close to an area which has Indian reservations, and where it's a former protectorate, ex-colony of the Netherlands, with a very high rate of addiction. And it struck me that perhaps certain problems that one finds in a reservation in Canada, one finds in that society as well. Diabetes, high rates of diabetes, I mean, and addiction. Um, and so, which of these cultures did you examine, and how did this come about? What were your conclusions in these experiences, researching the drug addiction, alcoholism among Native people in Canada?
I was very lucky because for a long time I was the youngest member of my psychology department. And as the youngest member, I had to teach the courses that nobody else wanted to teach, which meant I had to go to the native reserves and teach courses to natives. And I learned so much in doing that it was tremendously exciting. And I was doubly lucky because I married a woman who is a teacher and taught. She herself taught on Native Indian reserves. So I went with her, and I've done a lot of close stop study of native reserves, partly by accident, but partly because I quickly saw how important it is to understanding addiction. Now, the reserves that I went to are what we call recovering. That is to say, they're reserves where, if 50 years ago, everybody was alcoholic or drug addicted, or suicidal or depressive. I mean, these were terrible. These were hellholes for a long time. But they're recovering now. Sorry, they're recovering now, and we can see why they're getting better. And we can also see how they came to be hellholes in the first place, because there are still people who remember the process of settlement on the reserves. This is, again, it's just luck that I was in the right place at the right time, because in many other places, of course, the settlement of reserves took place hundreds of years ago, but here in Western Canada, it just took place quite recently. And what we can say for sure is that Native people, Indian people in Canada, had very little addiction, almost no addiction. They had other problems. They were not noble savages. They had, had slavery, they had wars, they had mental illness, they had all kinds of very serious problems, but they did not have addiction problems. Then all of them were put on reserves, and all of them had addiction problems. So we have perhaps the most conclusive experiment that's ever done if you take, hundreds of native tribal groups, put them all on separate reserves, they all get essentially 100% addiction.
Yes, did the colonial system of education, in which many young native people taken from their elders' homes and put in all kinds of boarding schools, were those schools a place where drug addiction or consumption began, or would you trace this more towards general dislocation, or was it?
The addiction problem began with alcohol, that the traders, the European traders, brought lots of alcohol to the reserves. So before what we call residential schools were established, the addiction problem was already in full swing. Now, the residential schools were terribly cruel. The children were punished severely for speaking their own language or participating in their own cultural kinds of rituals. The residential schools were designed to make the children into little Europeans. And of course they failed because the suicide rate and the disease rate and the escape rate in these schools was horrible. And there wasn't a lot of drug addiction in these schools because there was simply no way to get drugs in there. The schools were essentially prisons. So there wasn't a lot of drug addiction, but there was a lot of human despair and destruction. Then these children left the schools, those who survived, and went back to the native reserves, and then they became alcoholics and drug addicts. And the problem grew worse. But we can't say that the problem was caused entirely by the residential schools, because it existed before children went to the residential schools, but it was made worse by the residential schools.
And what were the reasons for this environment of addiction to flourish?
Well, I think we can sum it up simply. The reason is that when people's culture is destroyed, addiction takes the place. Addiction, excuse me, please.
No.
Addiction takes the place of culture, because addiction is a kind of culture, you see. If a person goes to the bar and drinks with their friends and tells the same old jokes and the same old stories that everyone has heard 100 times before, and has a nice fight before the evening is over, that's a kind of a cultural activity. And people who have no culture can use addiction as a culture. So in the case of the native people, the Indian people of Western Canada, it's absolutely clear that the destruction of their culture caused almost 100% addiction. There's no result clearer than that. It's documented literally hundreds of times. And as you have pointed out, Arturo, it's not just true in Canada, of course. It's true everywhere in the world. And how did we explain it? We explained it by going back to the myth of devil drugs. We said, oh, those natives, those Indians can't drink. Alcohol makes them go crazy. And therefore the cause is the alcohol. But we can now prove that the cause wasn't the alcohol. The way we can prove it is that in lots of places, not in Canada, but in lots of places, the natives already had alcohol by the time the Europeans came, because they could make their own. They in perhaps in Argentina, I don't know, but
Yes.
okay. In certainly in Central America, in Mexico.
In fact, oh, sorry.
Indians had lots of alcohol before the Europeans. And they didn't become addicted because the Europeans brought alcohol. They became addicted because the Europeans came and destroyed their culture.
And if we try to go on the current or in the present, in the present moment, where with the infiltration of the free market and with the endless wars and conflict, and people are moving from one place to another, trying to find shelter or a safe place. But still, you have reaction. So people are going a bit on the sides of the metropole. Do you see similar, or can we explain? Can we try? Can we understand the current structure of society from this using the filter of the dislocation theory? Can you see similar trends happening?
Oh, yes. I think that wherever we can test it, the dislocation theory seems to be borne out. Now, in lots of places, we can't test it carefully. We see that there are refugee people. We see there are people escaping from wars, and we see that they tend to have problems of addiction and suicide and insanity and everything. They have every possible mental problem, and it looks exactly like it's caused by the destruction of their culture. But it's not something we can research carefully. It takes ultimately, generations to do careful historical research. But all the indications are now that when you destroy people's culture in the most modern ways, with modern wars and modern mining companies and modern interventions which destroy culture, addiction is one of the results. It's not the only result, of course, but it's one of the horrible results of these things.
And addiction, it's not just the drug abuse, it's different types of addictions. Every action or substance that one cannot get rid of and always gets back to, regardless of the aftermath of it. So,
yes, I think it's important to say that addiction is not just drugs. One of the really visible addictions right now is cult addictions or fanatic religious addictions, where people become, addicted to various kinds of cults and do terrible things. Um, and I think we can see that kind of addiction to these silly cult ideas is doing at least as much harm in the world as drug addiction right now. And I think we can clearly see that the cause is the same, that society breaks down, culture breaks down, people can turn to drugs and as it were, join the culture of the alcoholics in the bar or the drug addicts on the street, or they can join the culture of the cult followers of crazy militant cults and go out and start killing people. I believe that all addiction fits the same mold. Now, this is very hard to prove, but I base it just on being 50, having been in the field for 50 years. I have talked to a lot of people. I know how addicted people talk. I have learned this, and I find the same kind of experience from people who are addicted to cults, people who are addicted to money, people who are addicted to sex, and people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs.
Some of the ways in which you describe this, even though you describe it very simply, it does make a lot of sense. For example, in the society where I grew up or was born and raised, you have the Pentecostal church, which people who are participating, they get into a state of ecstasy when the Holy Spirit comes into them.
Yeah.
And it's very much like a high. And these churches replace many patterns, many forms of support that they would otherwise get from society. And I also found it very interesting the way you say that addiction is a culture, because in my uh, experiences, sometimes I was around the environment where people smoke crack cocaine. I myself am not a user, but the whole world of the crack cocaine user, it is a culture. It's a place, crack house, a place where somebody can go to where they're accepted. There are certain words and rituals and system that they understand. And it is a culture that does replace other absences that are missing. So we're curious, like, how how do you catalog these cultures of addiction? Have you gone into, for example, studying the effect on the brain, or gone into have you analyzed the different the slang or the specific words that are used in these subcultures of addiction? Like, how do you prove the link between destruction of culture or even cultural genocide and the emergence of addiction as a culture?
I think that is where the research begins. I don't have a good answer to your question, but it's a very good question. How do we scientifically demonstrate that addiction is a culture? Well, I don't know. I visited a lot of addiction cultures. I've spent a very long period of time with drug addicted people and alcoholic people and all the rest. Um, and it feels the same. That's all I'm prepared to say. Um, it feels the same, and other people have the same experience. You Arturo, are saying you've had the same experience yourself with crack cocaine culture. Yes, it's a culture, but the problem is that one of our problems is that we have a lot of scientific research on the brain, which is very, very good research, but it's all aimed at proving essentially the devil drug theory of addiction. And it doesn't succeed in proving the devil drug theory of addiction. But we don't have that kind of scientific research to prove let's say the cultural theory or the dislocation theory of addiction. We don't have that kind of research. And you could ask why we don't. I think it's a very important question. I mean, who provides the money for drug addiction research? I think we have to ask these kinds of political questions. So sometimes my colleagues tell me, well, look, don't be so political. You're a psychologist. Just talk about the addiction. Don't talk about politics. But I think that's impossible. I think we have to be political if we are to understand this problem. It's not just a medical or a psychological problem. It is also a political problem.
So you please go ahead, Peter.
Well, if you had taken their advice, you would not have won the Nora and Ted Sterling Prize in support of controversy recent years.
That's right.
So can you tell us more about having won the prize in support of controversy, and what do you believe exactly they were rewarding? Is it your entire career? Was it the dissent during the 1995 World Health Organization cocaine research project, in which you, according to some sources on the internet, came to the conclusion that casual or occasional use of cocaine is not enough to guarantee addiction, cerebral addiction?
Well, how interesting that you know all this. I have had a very contentious life as a researcher, but I have been supported. I've been lucky in many ways. And one is that I've been supported by my university. My university let me do research which never got any grant money, and rarely got any recognition in scientific bodies, although it got published in the best journals. It was good research, but it rarely got recognition, and some of it was overtly censored. I participated in the study you've mentioned, the 1994 World Health Organization cocaine project, which did some of the really important research in this area and has never been published. It was censored, and we can now prove it. For years, I wouldn't talk about that, the WHO cocaine project, because nobody would believe me that it was actually censored. But now the data has been published, and we can say it was censored by the United States, by with threatening to withdraw all funding from the World Health Organization. Well, they finally gone ahead and done that now, but they were threatening it in 1995 in order to prevent the cocaine research from being published. So it is true that there's a political wing to this whole problem. And I've been lucky enough to keep my job in the university, not get fired, and still tell the truth.
But is there a strong case against the hypothesis that cocaine addiction has a lot to do with dopamine and the destruction of the dopamine receptors, the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is associated with feelings of success and superiority, which is part of the chemistry triggered by cocaine? Is it that this is not true, or does it simply not suffice in order to explain addiction?
Again, Arturo, you've asked exactly the right question. It is true. Of course, cocaine mimics the effects of dopamine, and the presence of cocaine has an effect on dopamine receptors, but it does not suffice to explain cocaine addiction at all. And the mistake is not in the research. It's very good research. The mistake is overgeneralizing the research to make it seem that that is the answer to cocaine addiction. What we can show, of course, is that we used to say, well, crack cocaine is the most addictive drug on earth. And it is the most addictive drug on earth because of the effect that it has on dopamine receptors. Well, now we know that there are lots of things which are as addictive as crack cocaine, which have no particular effect on the dopamine receptors. So it's not the explanation. Or here's another way to put it. There are lots of pleasures in the world which mimic the effect of dopamine. Sex is a major one, of course. But that doesn't mean that everyone who gets involved with sex becomes a sex addict. Of course not. And the WHO cocaine research shows that most people who get addicted with cocaine, including crack cocaine, do not become cocaine addicts. So there is an effect of cocaine on dopamine receptors, but what needs to be explained is, why does a very small proportion of the people who undergo that effect become addicted? And there we need a whole different kind of explanation. It goes, if you see what I'm saying, they are all affected in the dopamine receptors, but only a few become addicted. Why?
Well, I see a parallel to recent critiques of the psychopharmacology industry, where there are many controversies and critiques of the idea that neuroscience, for example, explains all, or neurochemistry explains all mental illness. And this has a lot to do with the culture in which people hope that the latest pill from the pharmacological industry will regulate the brain of mental patients and solve problems. In Latin America, Chile, which is the country most fond of neoliberal policies, is also a country where somebody who goes to psychologists is most likely to immediately get an antidepressant. Do you see a similarity here between too simplistic approach to psychological health that leads immediately to a prescription drug or serotonin, or
yes, I strongly suspect there is a exact parallel there, but I hesitate to talk about depression, for example, because I haven't done 50 years of research on it. But it looks to me like it's exactly the same situation. Right now, I hate to think of it, there are millions of children who are being put on psychiatric drugs because they don't behave well in the classroom. Um, I have grandchildren. I don't like even to think about this, because I mean they're just children. They're not sick in the brain. They're just children, and
And
I think we have a collective delusion here that we can solve our cultural problems by administering psychoactive drugs or psychoactive medications.
um,
I think that delusion is extremely dangerous. And the reason we have the delusion, if I may just finish this, the reason we have the delusion is it's so hard to face the fact that our cultures are inadequate to raise children that are going to be healthy and strong. We have to face that fact because that's really where the ultimate problem lies.
and if I can continue in that line about the political question and the mental health problems. So, for example, Professor Irving Kirsch in his book *The Emperor's New Drug* describes the interest of pharmaceutical companies in pushing the drugs by hiding some of the publications and salami slicing of data so that they can show that the drug or the pill that they're developing is way better than the placebo and the nocebo effect mechanisms. And one aspect of this problem is that national institutions, for example, FDA in the US or various institutions in Europe, they collude with these companies. So to kind of not publish all the results that they have. And if you look one step further, he showed that the funding that these institutions come are not only from taxpayers, rather they are from the pharmaceutical companies. So you have the private sector giving
Yes.
money to national institutions. So how problematic is this situation?
Again, I hesitate to say too much here because I have not studied this carefully, but I believe that it's extremely problematic. In the addiction field, the parallel is that there's an enormous addiction treatment industry, which is worth tens of billions of dollars each year.
Mm.
And this industry functions in part by pumping drugs, by promoting drugs of various sorts, which are marginally effective. And it seems in the addiction industry, it's clear to me that the effect of the companies on government institutions and on public attitudes is dangerous and increasing. Now,
And
in the area of depression, you're raising this question. I don't know, but it looks to me like an exact parallel.
and so what do you think? I mean, in the fight against addiction, if you say, mostly in the US, they use the statement, the war against drugs, or the war against terrorism, or the war against I don't know what. And then lately with the latest pandemic, that we also heard this war rhetoric being brought on the front. So do you think it's a bit also problematic that there's always this war rhetoric narrative that's being brought up to mobilize people? Is there another way to engage all society in these problems?
Well, yes, I think the war rhetoric is dangerous, not only problematic, but dangerous. Yes, of course, there must be another way, but we don't know it. I would like to offer an example here because your question leads, I mean, it's a wonderful question. It leads into all kinds of topics. But I would like to mention the mystery of the Nordic countries right now, if I may. And that is this, that when I say the Nordic countries, I mean Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland. These are countries which are very good at solving social problems. I really think most Canadians admire these Nordic countries because they solve social problems so much better than we do. And they solved the problem of COVID-19 brilliantly. If you look at the statistics, you will see that all these countries that I've mentioned have extremely low levels of COVID-19, not quite as low as New Zealand or Cuba or China, but very, very low levels of COVID-19. They've solved those problems, and they've solved them without war. They've solved them by reasonable government intervention and people trusting the government and cooperation and compassionate ways. And so we have to admire these countries. But if we look at those same countries and say, have they solved the problem of drug addiction? They haven't. They treat their drug addicted populations way better than other countries do, and they have many fewer people in prison and much lower levels of crime associated with drug addiction and so forth, but they still have the same amount of drug addiction as other countries. So what I'm saying is, yes, there is a non-war-like solution, and we're looking for it. And the Nordic countries, I say, are leading the way in looking for it, but they haven't found it. We don't know what the solution is to the drug addiction problem or the larger addiction problem, because really nobody has solved it. We can only look to the past and say, well, look, it doesn't have to be part of our culture because it wasn't part of many cultures in the past. But how we can live in the modern world and not be afflicted with these addiction problems is the problem we haven't solved yet.
Well, it seems that the Nordic countries have medicalized the problem, and in that sense, are very different from the Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan conservative position in the United States of moralizing the problem. But it seems your research also critiques the medicalization of the problem, seeking an organic or biological source of it.
The Nordic, if I can just take it there, because that's such a big point already. The Nordic countries have medicalized the problem, but they have also socialized the problem. Like, for example, they provide housing. Everybody in Denmark has a house or a place to live, an apartment anyway. Everybody has a reasonable, nobody's homeless, but nobody is in poverty. Everybody has reasonable access to education and healthcare. They have socialized the intervention as well. But even that has not overcome the addiction problem. And there's the mystery.
And
Sorry, speaking of war rhetoric, it's become increasingly infamous in recent years that Adolf Hitler was addicted to amphetamines or speed.
Yeah.
And that Winston Churchill also dabbled in cocaine.
Oh, I didn't know.
Oh, well,
But he was a big thinker anyway.
How do you believe the two were related?
How do I believe the two are related?
Hitler's speed addiction and Hitler's penchant for absolute destruction, like, if they were related.
Oh, well, of course I don't know. I don't know these men, but I would speculate. I would be glad to speculate. I speculate that Hitler was an enormously addicted human being. Hitler was the manifestation of Plato's curse, if you will. He grew out of a declining democratic republic, and he was everybody was getting addicted, and he was the most addicted of all, and he was addicted to power and drugs. And of course of course it goes together. People, it doesn't matter whether you're Hitler or just a guy on the street here. People don't just have one addiction normally. They're apt to have two or three, and to interchange them and to rely on different ones at different times. So I would see it from the point of view of addiction. We might say that Hitler is a fairly typical addicted guy, except that because he was addicted to power and succeeded in attaining the power that he needed, he almost destroyed the world. Winston Churchill, well, of course, he's a good guy to me, but he was also a extreme power hungry individual, and he was cleverer than Hitler. He managed to get power in a way that he wielded it and was admired for having his power, and maybe saved the world from Hitler. But maybe the dynamics is similar. Maybe if we really want to talk about addiction and talk about it at the highest level, then maybe we would have to say that addiction is the quality that homeless, crack addicts, evil maniacs like Hitler, and saints like Mother Teresa have in common. And then we have to say, how do we deal with that?
You mean, in a sense, the mechanics or dynamics that lay in the background, but not how they manifest themselves in the society afterwards.
Of course. Thank you. Yeah, I mean the psychological dynamics of addicted people maybe are not different than Mother Teresa and Hitler and Joe the junkie down on the street. And
you mean like there are different variables and factors that play a role in which the person can not decide, but like would foster one aspect than the other. So when people say that if humans are good or bad in nature, well, maybe we can say that no, we have both, but then you have to look which variables and environments supports one side and the other to nourish and nurture, rather than saying no, we are just good or we are just bad. So it's kind of this binary thinking that's problematic.
That's right. I'm saying that the moral analysis, of course, is necessary. We're talking morality is a very real thing, but I'm saying that we have very simplistic kinds of morality which confuse us, and we could say, well, addiction is bad, but wait, if we read the King James version of the Bible, which I grew up with, addiction is not bad. It's listed as one of the things that St. Paul listed as one of the qualities of some of the good people in the 1 Corinthians.
And how
it's a complicated issue is what I'm trying to say, but all addicted people have something in common. They don't have a settled cultural normal life. They don't have a life that's the alternative to addiction.
And how do you think the current, like with the infiltration of free market and the breaking of social bonds and people moving the whole time, breaks these bonds, this safety nets? And do you think, or where do you think spirituality, in a way, redefining the meaning, trying to reimagine the collective, not just regarding going back to the nation states, and how do you think art and culture and music help in rehabilitating these bonds, but not the previous, but rather a new, so in a way to reimagine the collective that we want to have again?
Well, I like that phrase, to reimagine the collective. Yes, I think we're in a transition. Like if we look back 1,000 years and beyond, we see a world in which most people are living in a collective, a settled culture. And if we look at our times, we see a situation where most people cannot live in a settled culture. Settled culture is broken down not only by wars and poverty, but by everyday life in a market-driven society where everybody is competing for the goods that they need, and everybody is a part of huge economic machineries that they know nothing about. People are cogs in enormous machines, and we can't have, most of us, except the lucky ones, but most of us can't have a settled cultural life right now. And what we have to look forward. We can't look back. We're not all going to become native Indians again. We can't do that. There's not enough land for that. We have to reformulate collectivity in the future. And that is the job of younger people than me. One of the experiences that I love to have is to go to school playgrounds. And it's, old men shouldn't hang around on school playgrounds because people say, who is that old man standing there watching the children? But I do that anyway. And I go and look at the children playing. Now, on this island, I don't do it because it would be crazy. But I used to live in a city, Vancouver, Canada, which was the most ethnic city in all of Canada. That is, Canada is an immigrant country. We are from everywhere. And this is the most ethnic city in the most ethnic country that there is. And I used to watch the children. They're all different colors, and they have all different ethnic backgrounds, and they're making culture. And I could watch it. And I think that human culture is, it's irrepressible. It's like springtime. You can't stop it. It comes out when people are together. It doesn't matter what color they are, or their languages, or all the rest of it. It comes out, and that's our hope for the future. But that takes generations, of course. We may not have generations to wait.
Well, the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda said, "You can cut the flowers, but you cannot stop the spring from coming."
Exactly. No, who said that?
Pablo Neruda.
Oh, yeah, good. Thank you.
So I have two questions for you as we approach the almost near, somewhat near the end of our show. Since we assume you have witnessed the 60s, during the 1960s, movements like the psychedelic movement somewhat imitated the use of psychedelic drugs by Native American tribes like the Navajo and the Oglala, the use of peyote and so forth. But the hippies, the people who experimented in the 1960s, like Chris Leary and so on, used such psychedelic substances, of course, outside of their cultural context, shamanic practices. Do you believe that these movements of the 1960s that use psychedelics, do you see them as having made mistakes, or did they get something fundamentally right?
Again, a wonderful question. Well, I was there, of course, and I was a young man from a declining country. I grew up in the United States before I moved to Canada when I was 30. And I was part of the psychedelic culture. And so to answer your question, did it make mistakes? Of course, everybody makes mistakes. But I also was, I believe I was able to see the potential of the psychedelic culture, in the sense that it enables, what it does is it enables people to think much more openly, and it enabled people to do cultural experiments that would have seemed crazy at any other time, but they did them anyway. And most of them were crazy, but some of them worked out pretty well. And so we have institutions left over from the 1960s that are very valuable, like Greenpeace. Um, and I think psychedelics may have a role, um, in forming new culture. But as I say, I go and stand on the and watch the children in the playgrounds. I don't think they need they need LSD. Uh, they seem to do it anyway. But I think psychedelics may have a role, and I think, as you will, I know you're both aware, there is a psychedelic um, resurgence now, and I think that may have an important role to play. I don't think it's the key to anything, but I think it may indeed have a role to play.
So, in the case of people from damaged cultures who end up seeking a consolation or substitute for damaged culture and addiction, have you seen the opposite effect? Have you seen people emerge or be cured from their addictions by regaining a lost cultural context?
Oh yeah, oh
Case?
yeah. I mean, every psychologist has seen that. You, Most people who recover, now we're talking about primarily drug addicts because that's what psychologists do primarily. But most people who recover from drug addiction do it without, they don't do it because of any therapy. They do it because they find a culture that works for them. Sometimes, in many cases, they find religion, and it's not a cult, a dangerous cult religion. It's just a religion which gives them a reason to live, and a place in a community of like-minded people, and they do very well. Or often they find politics. And I have seen this, that people find, for example, political homes in the Green Party, or in the uh, various democratic movements, and all of a sudden they have reasons to live, and they forget about being addicted. Now, it's an important fact. I don't know how much you know this literature, but that most people who become drug addicted recover without treatment. Now, I'm saying most people. I don't mean just a few. The, the larger number of people who become addicted recover without treatment, and they have been studied carefully. And when they recover that way, they recover by finding themselves a place in a community. This is a very, very, very well documented story.
But what about the withdrawal syndromes? Do you mean they gradually wean off these substances? Because
Sometimes they gradually wean off, sometimes they stop dramatically. Well, very suddenly. It doesn't matter too much. I mean, like I have worked primarily in my earlier career with heroin addicts who have very bad withdrawal symptoms, but they would all tell me, I can go through withdrawal, man. That's what they say. I go through withdrawal, man. It's not a big problem. Um, they can do that. It's what happens after that's the big problem. So withdrawal is really not a major factor in addiction. What the major factor is that when people stop taking drugs, there's a hole, an emptiness in their life, and that has to be filled. And the majority do fill it. They find something and they stop using drugs. Now, the ones who don't stop, of course, are the ones who keep psychologists like me in business, and the ones who keep us worrying about addiction, and the ones whose numbers appear on the graphs. But most do stop, and that single fact, um, is usually ignored. It's almost ignored as much as Rat Park was ignored. But
But do you think that, I mean, I agree that the multidimensional solution for the problem is necessary, but at one point also people use harm reduction as a, I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I notice it like it's a tool to maintain the current structure. So for example, say people say, let's legalize this drug, to make it legal. So
yeah,
then you create a market. So you have all these forces. You have the producers who want to maintain this market, you have the consumers. But if there's no political discourse about the structure or the environment in which this addiction was allowed to nurture, so it's not just about one solution, it's a multidimensional solution that should be implemented, right?
absolutely. Yeah. The harm reduction works very well for some people.
But if you don't take
Pardon?
sorry. Yeah, but if you don't take the political structure, socioeconomic problems with it, you will just create a new market that will have its own momentum that you don't. It will just go by itself. Like it, you'll have producers and consumers that will feed on this market.
Yeah. I mean, that again, that's the Nordic mystery. Like they have very good harm reduction. They have very good treatment. They have very good social justice provisions. And yet they still have the addiction problem. Why? Well, they haven't addressed the basis, the toxicity of the modern world, and nobody knows how to do it yet. But it has to be addressed, and that's why that's why the field of addiction is a mess, because the real problem is extremely difficult and terrifying. If I'm telling you that the modern world is going to keep generating more and more addicted people, that's terrifying news. Of course, you would have turned me off right now, but it's true. And therefore, it's much easier to say, oh, well, we'll solve the problem with harm reduction, or we'll solve the problem with drug war, or we'll solve the problem with, my special treatment drug, or whatever it is. These simplistic solutions arise because the real problem is so frightening.
I have two last short questions, but they are interconnected. So when I discuss with people my age and like in the late 20s that about the environmental catastrophe and how we should like try to work in a certain direction, I see the motivation to say that no, I don't want to. Some of the arguments that I just live one life. I deserve what I have. This merit of stock, and how much is it related to how children are raised? Like children are asked to go to schools, they have to go on a certain structure, so their playing field is restricted. So they grow up in this idea that okay, when I get that age, I will get this token. So when now you're trying to tell them that you need to reduce this and that, they will feel uncomfortable because this is part of their identity now. Do you think that's also the model that children are being sold in is also problematic?
Yes. I mean, who is teaching the children? I look at my grandchildren and I see that they're being taught by a screen like this one, only the screen that's got video games on it. And I think the study of video game culture is amazing. It's a culture that I think you're describing, that it's highly competitive. You don't really cooperate in any real sense, and you win or lose, and you expect a reward if you win, and there really isn't any other reward. I think we have to learn to raise our children again, just like we have to learn many things again.
Uh, And then my last question. So when in a say materialistic, well-doing society, when you also discuss this environmental problem, like if someone's sitting in their couch watching TV, seeing the news of a lot of numbers of catastrophic events, but still the second day they would go to the supermarket and they see the stores are all full with colorful things. And then they go in the evening, they see this news, they have this disconnection between what's happening. So how problematic this is, that our alienation from food production, from all the production processes that we kind of just put a wall around us and we don't see them because of how the production process is going. So we are disconnected from the problem somehow, and we don't want to see it, or it's quite difficult to see it.
Yes. Well, there is that blindness you describe is very real. I certainly see it, and I'm probably part of it. The discovery of my old age is how many people do see the connection. I mean, there are lots of people who do see that, don't have that blindness, and do see the connections. And you guys are part of that group, and I like to think I'm part of that group. And that group is growing. So we, culture responds to disasters by evolving, and that's what's happening. There's a process of cultural evolution that's going on, and the joy of my later life is just how many people do see those connections, but it's going to take a long time, and we may not have such a long time.
I guess we are at the end of our conversation, interesting conversation, I would say. If you
starting.
Yeah, yes. Do you have anything?
That part.
Yeah, true. I agree. Do you have any last comment about the topic, about how to reimagine the collective to take into consideration all the suffering that you're going through?
Any last comment on the topic of globalization, the globalization of addiction?
Well, I think we've said it all. I mean, my last comment is that my faith is with younger people than myself, and I'm really honored to be part of your production here, and very happy that you're doing what you're doing. I hope you just keep doing it.
Great. I would like to thank you, Professor Bruce Alexander, for joining us, and wish you a nice day.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That was fun.
Yeah, we enjoyed it. I mean, I enjoyed it as well. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Bruce Alexander.
Thank you, Arturo and Mohammad.
Thank you, and thanks, John.